All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for being here with me today. I'm your host, Nolan. A couple big topics we're going to focus on today. We're going to start off here by talking about the latest out of Ukraine. Zelensky has turned down the 28-point peace plan that was offered by Donald Trump a couple weeks back, and he's also said that he's refusing to give up any Ukrainian land to Russia. So we'll talk about what all this means for future negotiations. We'll see where things are at right now, and then we'll also talk about the latest delusional takes coming from the Europeans, which, as always, are ridiculous. And then later on in the show, we're going to switch gears to South America. In the latest out of Venezuela, the U.S. just on Wednesday seized an oil tanker headed from Venezuela to Cuba in an act that they're calling sanctions enforcement, but it really more clearly is an act of war. So we'll talk about all this today and more on the Quest for Clarity podcast.
It is about who we are. It is about what we believe.
They're building up this case just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
The more you tell the truth, the stronger you become.
Mr. Speaker, we're not rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic tonight. We're putting coal in the boiler and setting a course for the iceberg.
Maybe we should improve the liberty of our own country before we seek to do so abroad. Some of us have paid attention to the fact that the expert class, including the foreign policy experts, lie all the time. The correct answer to this, of course, as it always is liberty. All right, everybody, before we begin, if you wouldn't mind going right down below this video and hitting like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate that. Also, if you wouldn't mind going to my Instagram, X, and Spotify accounts and giving all those a follow, I'd really appreciate that as well. Let's get into the show. We'll start off here by talking about Zelensky turning down the 28-point peace plan from Donald Trump, and this comes amidst growing impatience from Donald Trump over the ridiculousness of Vladimir Zelensky, and you can't blame Donald Trump for becoming impatient with Zelensky. As we all know, Zelensky has been always, this entire time, refusing to really give an inch in these war negotiations, even as his country's population, the infrastructure, the economy, as his entire country crumbles in front of his eyes, he's refusing to acknowledge reality and see that the Russians are going to take at least some Ukrainian land, whether he likes it or not. So we'll get into it here. Start off here with this article from The Independent, basically assessing the latest events from the last couple days in these negotiations. It says, quote, Ukraine is to present a revised peace plan to President Donald Trump's administration on Tuesday after weeks of negotiations which have failed to produce an agreement. The latest iteration of the deal comes after President Zelensky remained firm in his refusal to cede crucial strategic territory to Russia. The Ukrainian leader insisted that he has, quote, no legal right to do so under Ukrainian or international law and no, quote, moral right either. Trump has expressed growing impatience with Ukraine after presenting a 28-point peace plan that appeared to cede to many of Moscow's demands. He accused Zelensky of not reading the proposal. So the latest is that Zelensky is, yes, as it says there, not willing, seemingly, to give up any of the land that Russia has taken in eastern Ukraine. And if we're all acknowledging reality here, the real issue isn't that Zelensky is willing to give up the land, because at this point, much of the land is actually, literally not Zelensky's to give. Russia has taken, violently, and in this war, taken much of this land in eastern Ukraine, whether it be in the Donbass and Donetsk and Luhansk, whether it be in Zaporizhia, and whether it be back in 2014 with Crimea. Much of the eastern provinces of Ukraine are under Russian control at this point, after almost 4 years of this war. And so Zelensky now coming out and saying he's unwilling to officially seize the land to Russia is just not dealing in the realm of reality. And it's very irresponsible for someone like Zelensky to continue to think that he's going to be dragging the West in this war further and further through this delusion. And Donald Trump is growing justifiably angry with Zelensky for the fact that he's unwilling to just deal in reality here. And we've gone over it time and time again here on the show, but just to lay out again, just so everyone watching is aware, the facts on the ground right now, as I laid it out, Russia has taken much of the land of eastern Ukraine, whether it be the Donbass region, provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, whether it be Zaporizhia and Crimea. These are completely, basically at this point, except for small parts of each, under Russian control. And at this point, the Ukrainian forces along the front line of this war, The Ukrainian forces are really wearing thin to the point where any week now, any month now, it's coming up real soon. It's very possible that the Russian army could simply break through the front line because, as it's been described by many people who have been on the ground in this war, the front line looks like Swiss cheese because it is so thin. Because Ukraine, and it's getting more and more obvious to everyone in the mainstream media to the point where they can't even deny it at this point, the Ukrainians are literally plucking elderly men off the streets of Kiev and throwing them in the front line. They're literally pulling up next to people on the street in unmarked vans and throwing them in the back of the van and just giving them a gun and forcing them to go to the front line. This is the situation in Ukraine. And Russia, at this point, is running a war economy, basically, and they show no signs of being willing to stop this war unless they're to get this land. And they have much more men on the front lines. It's basically just churning it out. It's basically a meat grinder on the front line. And Russia, just the facts on the ground, their population size and the landmass, the economy, they have much more men to just throw at the front line and not feel as big of an effect on their country as Ukraine has felt. The entire male population of Ukraine has either fled from the beginning of this war or has been killed in this war or being plucked off the streets as we speak. So the entire Ukrainian population has just been utterly decimated by this war, and it seems that the only men who have not gone and fought on the front lines of this war are Zelensky's aides. It's like it's at that point, and that's obviously parody. I'm not serious by that, but it feels that way at this point because so many Ukrainian men are just being thrown to the front lines where they're at the bottom of the barrel, and they're taking the most elderly men they can find. They're getting men with mental disabilities, and they're throwing them at the front lines. It's gotten to a ridiculous point. And speaking of Zelensky having no incentive to end the war, all of this comes in the context of the latest corruption scandal overwhelming the Zelensky administration, the Zelensky government. We covered it here on the show a couple episodes ago, but it just keeps getting worse to the point where even the New York Times, the most mainstream corrupt news organization, is having to put out scathing articles about this and exposing the entire game here for Zelensky's government. They put this out a couple days ago. It's titled "Zelensky's Government Sabotaging Oversight, Allowing Corruption to Fester," and it's insane, and they're completely correct. But they're going to try and play this game. And by the way, when I read this New York Times article, it's nothing that anyone who's been paying attention doesn't already know. So when they report this stuff acting like they're breaking news here, it's really comical because this is what always happens. This happened with COVID. This happened with Joe Biden. Every time there's a major mainstream media scandal where the mainstream media has been very openly collaborating with the power players of the world to run this narrative that's very obviously fake to anyone who's paying attention, whether it be in, again, as I said, COVID, Joe Biden, now in Ukraine. Anytime the mainstream media has appeared to be playing along with this phony narrative, when it gets too obvious to even lie about, the mainstream media has to pretend they're the ones breaking the story. This is like the routine. So now, as we saw a couple weeks ago, Financial Times put out a big expose on Zelensky's corruption, and they did break the story on how deep it went with the gold toilets and the sacks of cash. But we all knew from the beginning, the people who are really paying attention here, we all knew about the corruption from within the Zelensky government, how all these guys are taking kickbacks from these deals. And we're just getting the details now because all these mainstream media outlets have the infrastructure to get these key details. But we'll start off here by reading this New York Times article, which just goes into detail about the corruption and how it came to be in Ukraine. It says, quote, "When Russian troops invaded Ukraine, Kiev's Western allies faced a dilemma: how to spend billions supporting a government fighting Russia without watching the money vanish into the pockets of corrupt managers and government officials. The stakes were high because Ukraine's vital wartime industries, power distribution, weapons purchases, and nuclear energy were controlled by state-owned companies that have long served as piggy banks for the country's elite. To protect their money, the U.S. and European nations insisted on oversight. They required Ukraine to allow groups of outside experts, known as supervisory boards, to monitor spending, appoint executives, and prevent corruption. Over the past 4 years, a New York Times investigation found the Ukrainian government systematically sabotaged the oversight, allowing graft to flourish. President Zelensky's administration has stacked boards with loyalists, left seats empty, or stalled them from being set up at all. The leaders in Kiev even wrote company charters to limit oversight, keeping the government in control and allowing hundreds of millions of dollars to be spent without outsiders poking around." So, and just by the way, the framing in this is just hilarious. After 4 years of the New York Times investigation, okay, You want to talk about 4 years of a New York Times investigation. How about the last 4 years of the New York Times being the lead purveyor of these ridiculous narratives about Zelensky, just Zelensky alone. Never mind the rest of this phony made-up narrative about the context about Ukrainian politics, which, again, anyone who knows anything about geopolitics knows Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe. But New York Times here, acting like they've been investigating this for 4 years, and this is their grand report on this story. New York Times was the leading purveyor of this ridiculous narrative about Vladimir Zelensky, like he's a Churchill of our times, fighting for democracy on the front lines. They made it seem like he was some heroic figure sent from God to preach democratic values upon the rest of the West, and now he was going to morally lecture us and emotionally manipulate all of us into willingly giving away our tax dollars to this corrupt Zelensky government and all of his aides so they could go buy golden toilets and stack their suitcases with cash. This is the ridiculous narrative that the New York Times has been a part of. They've been the ones crafting this narrative, very detailed narrative over the past 4 years, and now they're going to come out of the woodworks and instead of just admitting they were wrong, they're going to act like they've been investigating it in the background this whole time, and now they finally have enough information to fully expose it, even though there's been many people on the internet who've been exposing this since the beginning. So save me this idea that the New York Times investigation has found over the past 4 years that there's been rampant corruption in Ukraine. Yeah, you're actually the one late to the party. Okay. But anyways, back to the substance of the story. Yeah. So back during the Biden administration, when this war began, these governments were looking for some checks and balances here for the cash that they were sending, the billions and billions of dollars they're sending to Ukraine. So they set up these very flimsy supervisory boards to just make sure the cash is going where they're saying it's going. And you think Joe Biden, who probably wasn't even aware half the time we were sending money to Ukraine, you think Joe Biden was going to seriously put checks on the Ukrainian money? See, this is the thing. I think the people who were probably concerned with putting checks on the money were like the higher ups, like the intelligence agencies that have more power than the president even has. But I doubt Joe Biden even cared. Joe Biden seemed the entire time, for all his faults, he seemed like a truly stupid person who maybe innocently believed in the cause that Zelensky was purveying. He probably believed Zelensky's shtick about democracy and freedom, how he's fighting for the people of Ukraine. He probably believed that. I may even give Joe Biden the benefit of the doubt. He might have been stupid enough to believe that because he's stupid enough to do a lot of other stupid stuff. So maybe he even believed that. And he probably wasn't even looking to enforce any sort of aid checks or any sort of audits of the aid to Ukraine because you think Joe Biden's really going to try and mess around with the money going to Ukraine. He probably was trying to send more than the intelligence agencies even wanted to send. So it's obvious that under a leader like Joe Biden, the Ukrainian government's going to just completely cash in on all the aid we're just giving them for free. So this is what's been going on over the past 4 years. And in this context, why would Zelensky negotiate for peace? To tie it back into what we were talking about before. In this context, Zelensky is in no position to want to negotiate for peace, as all of his corruption from the past 4 years is being uncovered, as opposition parties in Ukraine, which, by the way, are really radical opposition parties, just if you look into them, when now they have all of this to run on and potentially prosecute Zelensky with, now that his image has been shattered, why would he want to step down? He has no incentive to end this war. And amidst all this, we have the continued ridiculousness from the Europeans, who are now preparing for war with Russia, because that's what the world needs. So here we have another article from The Independent. It just reads, quote, Europe must prepare for a conflict with Russia on the scale of that our grandparents endured, NATO's Secretary General said in a stark warning to the West. Tensions have been escalating across the continent in recent weeks, following a spate of drone incursions into NATO airspace and a chilling statement by Vladimir Putin that his country is, quote, ready for war right now if Europe wants it. We are Russia's next target. We are already in harm's way, Mark Rutte said in a speech in Berlin on Tuesday. Russia has brought war back to Europe, and we must be prepared for the scale of war our grandparents and great-grandparents endured. Okay, so amidst all the chaos, amidst all the ongoing negotiations, always count on the Europeans to come in and try and mess up negotiations. Just like Boris Johnson did at the beginning of this war, there was ongoing negotiations between Zelensky and Putin, their teams, within months of the start of this war, and they were reportedly actually having some good progress towards making some sort of a peace deal so this war didn't have to expand to where it is now. And who other than Boris Johnson literally physically flew into these negotiations, crashed the party, and acted as a representative of the West and said the West is not ready to end this war and told Zelensky not to take the deal. He said, you don't negotiate with dictators. This is what Boris Johnson is telling Zelensky. And now here we are, 3.5, 4 years later, million people dead because of this. And here we still have the Europeans and the Secretary General of NATO advocating, trying to ramp up more military spending in Europe. Okay, how about if we're going to start with military spending? How about they spend it on NATO? Because right now the U.S. spends like 75%, or is paying like 75% of NATO right now. This is the problem with NATO. And by the way, just in a piece of news, Thomas Massie introduced a bill in the House to have the U.S. leave NATO. Doubt it will get any support, but good for Thomas Massie because that's the exact right answer here. These are the exact entangling alliances that the founders warned about. And it's hilarious. It's the exact same context, too, because the exact context of these warnings about entangling alliances was that we shouldn't be meddling in European affairs. This was like the exact context, and this is exactly what they're talking about now. So the state of affairs right now is that our military and our actions in Europe are contingent on what Britain and France and NATO want to do, not what's in America's interest. That's why it's so reckless to be part of a military alliance like this. Because now, if say France decides to get ridiculous and Macron decides to go insane and start a war with Russia, then we're on the hook for that. If, on the other hand, if at the end of this, if Russia in a couple of years takes all of Ukraine somehow, who knows, and then decides to keep going, then we're on the hook for that. So all of this, in the grand scheme of things, is not our business. Whether Russia gets a hold of Donetsk and Luhansk is not our business. But since we're in this empire mindset, and since we have this entangling alliance with all these European countries, and since this alliance provoked what we saw a couple years ago, the invasion of Ukraine, it provoked that because we constantly were expanding this alliance over decades and decades and decades with the knowledge that it was provoking the Russians. This alliance has done more harm than good, and it should have been disbanded back when the Cold War ended. Because right now, this alliance has been built on the mentality of keeping Russia out of the West. And the closer and closer it creeps up to Russia's border, the more it's been provoking Russia for a response like we saw a couple years ago. And that in no way justifies the response from Putin. Putin's been vicious in this war, committed war crimes, and yeah, it's wrong. It was very inappropriate what Putin did in this war. But what was also very inappropriate is NATO knowingly, because we have the documents to prove this. We have the messages from Bill Burns, the ambassador to Russia, to Condoleezza Rice from back in 2008, where he says explicitly that he's talked to people in Russia and they all say Ukrainian membership of NATO is a red line for the Russians and they can't accept that. So us knowing that, have gone year after year after year flirting with the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. And tell me, someone who's advocated for this, what is the actual tangible benefit to me, to the American people, of Ukraine joining NATO? Tell me. I'll wait. It doesn't exist. And you can't blame Ukraine for wanting to join NATO. Who wouldn't want the most powerful military in the history of the world to guarantee their defense? The question is, though, if we're thinking from an America First perspective, is that in America's interest? And the answer to that is obviously no. So that's where we'll leave it off for Ukraine. Of course, the ridiculousness we see there all the time. We'll move on now to Venezuela, where there is major news. There was just a major escalation just on Wednesday from the United States in this recent buildup against Nicolas Maduro. Now, I would highly recommend everyone go back and watch my last 2 episodes on this, where I go into greater detail in those than I'm going to today. But this latest buildup on Wednesday, this latest act of escalation, the United States seized an oil tanker that was leaving Venezuela headed to Cuba in what can only be described by any consistent mind as an act of war. And I'm not saying that from the Venezuelan point of view or any other point of view. I'm saying that from the United States point of view. We would view this, if it was done to us, correctly, as an act of war. How dare anyone invade our ships? How dare anyone just come and act like pirates and take our ship? That's how we would think. So if we're thinking about this from the other perspective, that's how we should be expecting Venezuela to think about this too. And we don't even have to imagine here. If you remember just a couple months back, like February, like a year ago almost now, I know it's distant memory. We were bombing the Houthis in the Middle East. And you might have thought in a vacuum, out of context, that was just a random bombing in the Middle East because we bombed the Middle East so much. But that came in the context of the Houthis not even attacking American ships. The Houthis were attacking Israeli ships in the Middle East and disrupting shipping lanes in the Middle East. So for that, we bombed them. We saw that as an act of war, or at least as a hindrance of free trade or whatever, and we bombed them for that. And by the way, in bombing them, we ended up killing a bunch of innocent civilians. We bombed an entire apartment building. But that's what the point of it is that we considered it an act of war, or at very least an act of aggression, or an inappropriate action, and we took the response of bombing the Houthis. We saw it as justified to bomb the Houthis for this. Okay, now, what would you call, with the same consistency, what would you call it when the United States boards and steals an oil tanker from Venezuela? Like, what would you call that? If we're going to be consistent here, that would be an act of war, and at the very least, a major act of aggression. And we've seen Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, they came out and condemned this, and we'll see what happens here. This is just, this alone is a crazy story. We haven't done this since 2014. We have not boarded a oil tanker and just taken it since 2014, and that was in the context of something in the Middle East. But this is a major act of escalation. You see, and by the way, there was this hilarious clip of some lady on CNN saying, yeah, this is normal. We do this all the time. Just completely oblivious to not knowing anything about anything. Like, no, we don't just do this all the time. This is obvious. This is a major escalation. We don't just seize oil tankers all the time. I don't know what you think is going on in the world. That's not what happens. This is a major act. And it comes amidst, of course, the sanctions, the maximum pressure campaign that started under the Trump administration is now continued under the Trump administration number 2. This maximum pressure campaign that was devised in the first term by John Bolton and now it's by Marco Rubio. This maximum pressure, max sanctions regime against Venezuela that is in an effort to have him step down voluntarily, to weaken the country so much that he steps down voluntarily. And as we've been talking about this over the past couple episodes here, we've spent a lot of time debunking this ridiculous drug narrative that's just been sweeping the media. This idea that Maduro is this head of this cartel, the Cartel of the Suns, which doesn't even exist. Tren de Aragua, which is just like not even, he does not control Tren de Aragua. And their idea that he's basically just sending these drug boats off the coast of Venezuela out on missions to kill Americans. They have to make it personal for you. This is just the propaganda. This is much like WMDs in Iraq. The lie, see, this is the consistent theme with these war lies. The lie always has to be to the point where it affects, it seemingly, if it were true, it would affect your personal life. The lie after 9/11 was that Iraq was colluding and conspiring with Al-Qaeda, and they were going to hand off the weapons of mass destruction that they didn't have to Al-Qaeda, who they weren't friends with, and they were going to use that to bomb Kansas. This was the narrative that they were telling. And if you believe that, then you're necessarily believing the story that, if true, means that you are at risk of being nuked by these terrorists. And for that reason, we have to take preemptive action against the Iraqi regime and take them out. They create this narrative that if you believe it, the only logical conclusion is that we must do what we have to do. This is the same thing in Venezuela. They're telling the story, the idea of the story is that Maduro is this drug kingpin who's taking kickbacks from all these drug profits or whatever, and that he's sending these drug boats out on missions to go kill Americans in America with their fentanyl. And since everybody in America knows somebody along some line who's been affected by fentanyl and it's overdosed on fentanyl, since it's affected every American's life, if you believe that story, and if you believe that there is a leader in South America who is directly at war with you by sending drug traffickers into this country to kill you, then necessarily, if you believe that, you have to kind of believe the end point, which is that we should go to war with that regime. They create this narrative that if you believe it, it'll lead you to justifying a war, when in reality, the war is for very different purposes. The war, in this purpose, depends on who you ask, but it's for a couple different reasons, none of which have to do with drugs, and that's been thoroughly debunked by the media. Nobody even believes that. The real purpose of this war, if you ask Marco Rubio and the South Florida cabal that's in our government, it would be to take out this communist dictator and fulfill their family legacy of freeing the people of South America from these communist regimes. This is literally what they say. They literally say this in interviews. You see all these people, literally like representatives in Congress right now from South Florida, who are literally saying this, like word for word on CNN and Fox News right now, saying that it's their family escaped Venezuela, and we have to go back and overthrow Maduro. This is the story that you hear from these people on Fox News. This is not parody. And the other story, which we'll get into right now, is the oil reserves in Venezuela, which are amongst the largest in the world. And as I said before, there are heavy sanctions on Venezuela, so that's affecting their ability to trade oil with the rest of the world. They're trying to cut off the main revenue for the Maduro regime in an effort to try and overthrow him. What's funny about those sanctions, though, is that it seems as if the oil lobbyists are still getting their oil from Venezuela. I want everyone at home right now to Google Chevron oil deal Venezuela, and you'll see that the U.S. government, amidst all the airspace being shut down, amidst all these sanctions in Venezuela, they're still allowing Chevron and their people, the oil staff of Chevron, to go down to these oil reserves right now, as we speak, in Venezuela, and access the oil, keep producing the oil in Venezuela. Amidst all the sanctions, amidst the airspace being shut down, they're still making time. The U.S. government is directly facilitating this. Chevron is still allowed to go to Venezuela and access the oil. Are you kidding me? It's not about the drugs. It's like ridiculous. That's like level 1 of the lies of this war. And level 2 is this public display of capturing the oil tankers in the high seas. It's like ridiculous. The idea we're not letting him trade any oil. Oh, by the way, we're keeping the oil. Like, who is benefiting from this war is a question you should always be asking. And that, by the way, that doesn't mean that who's benefiting from this war necessarily is responsible for lobbying for the war. But there are some suspects whenever someone benefits from the war that you should look into. The lobbyists. Who are the lobbyists who are lobbying hardest for this war? Well, it would be ExxonMobil, Chevron. Those are some places to look. And right now, amidst all the sanctions regime, Chevron is still allowed, per the U.S. government, to fly down to Venezuela and access the oil reserves. So that's a little funny. And it kind of debunks a lot of what they've been saying about Venezuela and about the propaganda for this war. So that's where we'll end it off for today. That's the latest of all the wars across the world. It doesn't seem like they'll be stopping anytime soon, so be sure to subscribe down below to make sure you get updates for all these wars across the world. And we'll continue updating you here on the show. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Please be sure to go down below, like and subscribe. Please be sure to go to my Instagram, X, and Spotify accounts and follow all those pages over there. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Have a good day.
It is about who we are. It is about what we believe.
They're building up this case just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
The more you tell the truth, the stronger you become.
Mr. Speaker, we're not rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic tonight. We're putting coal in the boiler and setting a course for the iceberg.